I'll start. Gods dance on their own bodies. New flowers open, forgetting death. Celestial eyes beyond the heartbreak of illusion. I see the gay creator. Bands rise up in anthems to the worlds, flags and banners waving in transcendence. One image in the end remains myriad-eyed in eternity. This is the work, this is the knowledge, this is the man. That was the final stanza of Allen Ginsberg's poem, Lysergic Acid, which he wrote on June 2nd, 1959, the day before his 33rd birthday. Ginsberg's first experience of LSD was undertaken at the first international conference on LSD therapy at the Palo Alto Mental Research Institute in California. The conference was organized by one Dr. Paul Hock, a gentleman financed by both the military and secret services in order to study the effects of LSD and other hallucinogens on human behavior. What we might describe today as the murky waters through which LSD passed in the 1950s. However, in providing the context for the drug aficionado, beat poet, and hedonistic mystic Allen Ginsberg, Hock and his shady financiers were unwittingly or otherwise ushering in that ephemeral marker that we know today as the psychedelic 60s. For all the controlled micro-social experiments that went on in the world at the behest of men in black and white coats, the psychedelic 60s was about society at large grappling with the psychedelic experience, asking what could it do for them? What's it going to tell them about themselves? What does it tell them about their society and their role within it? Moreover, the phenomenal, experiential, and downright mischievous nature of the LSD experience went to work on the minds of poets. And over the course of the following decade, their poetry became imbued with their journeys through other space. And eventually, they became more socially conscious, even raising radical appraisals of the cultural sphere they found themselves waking back up in. Considering the number of poets, however, who likely took LSD and other psychedelics during this period, there isn't a great deal of work that explicitly deals with the subject. And while, of course, a metaphorical reading or interpretation may easily elucidate that response that many of you will probably know so well, definitely a tripper, I will confine the poets and poems I discuss today to those with a more obvious connection. When Allen Ginsberg declared, "This is the work, this is the knowledge, this is the end of man," he might well have also said, "This is the end of 1950s man." He was unwittingly ushering in a widespread discombobulation of fixed notions, of personal identity, of cultural identity, and of the identity of society at large, which went through a whole phase of questioning itself through the 1960s. He later teamed up with Timothy Leary to undertake this project in a more widespread way, which kind of led to the rise of the psychedelic left in both the US and the UK. Before the human ends, however, and before they can establish their new vision of the everyday world transformatively back into the society in which they find themselves, the journey of the experience itself takes place. As every psychedelic revolution must begin with the insurrection of everyday experience, and in this case, the psychedelic experience. In the widely known context of the late 1950s, it was the psychologists and psychiatrists who held the magic, and thus the ego-defined body came in for the initial battering for people's experiences, and this is the point where the human ended. Take, for instance, the beginning of Ginsberg's poem Mescaline as a similar example. Writing Ginsberg, I stared in the mirror naked today. I noticed the old skull. I'm getting balder. My pate gleams in the kitchen light under thin hair, like the skull of some monk in old catacombs lighted by a guard with flashlight, followed by a mob of tourists. So there is death. The egoic end, however, is also the beginning. And today we will explore the notion that poetry of LSD is imbued with transformation, the end and the beginning. And thus ultimately how personal, cultural, and social transformation through psychedelics allowed poets and their poetry to develop a critique of themselves and society at large. More importantly, bearing in the mind of the context of Ginsberg's first LSD experience under the auspices of CIA money, and the passageway of LSD as a material from establishment-controlled substance to countercultural tool and moniker, LSD was turned back on its previous masters through poetry. The Secret Service tool for proliferating madness and the meltdown of the social and individual mind created a critique on the insanity of war and government. The poet George Andrews was among the first to systematically explore the psychedelic experience poetically and had a number of poems included in the eponymous journal The Psychedelic Review. A cycle of these poems was published in London by Tigran Press in 1966 and was entitled Burning Joy. The title reflects the pain and toils of his ecstasy, of birthing himself from himself to discover the greater mysteries with which the poetic imagination grapples. Of his collection, he wrote the following: "This cycle of 8 poems traces my trajectory through different phases of the psychedelic drug experience. It contains all I've been able to record of these mental voyages and was made from the most illegible scraps of paper found near me mornings after the lightning had struck. The human nervous system is a wheel, a subtle fire, a pulsating live mandala, an archetypal energy pattern flashing signals through space. So here is what the star inside me said. The end of man indeed, and the beginning of something else for Andrews. As he says, the cycle of 8 poems is a trajectory, it's a journey. Poetry during the early to mid-60s, whether it be Andrews or Leary's and Co.'s psychedelic guidebooks, were very much rooted in the journey as an overcoming of one's fixed identity, of the everyday and of the ego, and in many respects is the hero's journey. Indeed, Andrews begins his poem Amsterdam Reflection. This LSD is pure hero food. I dissolve into the diamond. The same rainbow that is in each drop of water is now in me. In retreating under the influence from the everyday, Andrews finds a poetic, cosmological world within him, where the macrocosm and the microcosm are collapsed in on one another. The rainbow is the meaning and the beauty of that cosmological spectrum that one ordinarily views as external in the everyday world of the conditioned ego, and which Andrews finds deep within his psyche. The burning joy, Andrews' socially conditioned ego, is birthing an identity of vastness that breaks apart his everyday. It makes an interesting development when he returns quite poignantly to the same metaphor halfway through the poem and says, that same rainbow that is in each drop of water is in each of us. Stay on the point of the diamond. His I becomes an us, and he finds himself no longer dissolving, but holding steady on the point of the infinite, the diamond. And at this place, from the point of view of the infinite, he looks back and reflects on the everyday world that he has left. And he writes, at the peak of its climax, the silence is resounding. Le soir blanc des mondes regardez s'envoler, go clear into that always present clamour. Soldiers take orders only from the rainbow radiance. Peace to the world, LSD is the only answer to the atom bomb, bringing transcendental purity into terrestrial form. At the climactic silence, when the white bird tweaks in his eye, there is a command. Go clear into that always present clamour, or in other words, the everyday world. The point of the diamond containing all colours of the rainbow is the only place he believes that soldiers should take their orders from. And through LSD illuminating the greater self, Andrews finds the answer to the atom bomb, that looming, glooming shadow that was casting long into the 1960s. To bring the transcendent down to the terrestrial is where he found his answer to war and the ravages that it was causing across the whole world. George Andrews, and later the psychedelic left, had found a critique of the everyday within the psychedelic experience, and it was mystical, yet it could only take form, in this case anti-war, ban the bomb, through their actions in the everyday world. The hero's journey, in one sense individual and in another sense universal, would need to be brought to bear upon the middle world, that of culture, society, and its politics. He finally ends Amsterdam Reflection with the lines, let the elixir current pass from person to person, from nation to nation, until the whole world is united in ecstasy. Or, let LSD pass from person to person and let them all ecstatically stand out from themselves, and see the futility of opposition in a unified world. From an American who travelled to Britain and Europe, it is necessary now to turn to an Englishman who travelled to America. Tom Gunn was a poet born in Gravesend in Kent. His family moved to London when Tom was 8, and after 2 years of national service, he went to study at Cambridge. Gunn's first collection of poetry, Fighting Terms, was published in 1954, and he continued to publish collections semi-regularly for the rest of his life. After university, however, he followed his university friend, the American Mike McCatay, to the US, taking up a teaching post at Stanford before finally settling in San Francisco. In the US, he found new importance and verve in his life. He was able to express his homosexuality in ways that were unthinkable in England at the time. He took a new mentor in the shape of the poet Yvonne Winters and was introduced to writers like Carlos Williams for the first time. He began experimenting with free verse, although he never gave up writing the stricter metrical forms with which he had grown up with. We'll return to that in a second. In San Francisco, he was well placed for the counterculture and psychedelic movements. And later in his life, he said the following to an interviewer: "Everyone was taking acid in 1965, and I decided to give up tenure then. I said I wanted to devote myself to poetry, but the real reason was that I wanted to go to concerts in the park and take lots of acid. I did quite a bit of it with all my friends in the next few years. It gave me all sorts of subject matter." Gunn said that he went through a dry writing spell during the early 1960s, and that coming out of this period into more poetic productivity coincided with doing an awful lot of acid. He said, "It was wonderful. It got rid of all these fixed notions and stirred you up, and you got wonderful visual imagery." Gunn's personal transformation was in part his adventure to a new land, America, and his poetry to the mid to late 60s, as he began writing again, became the record of that transformation as an artist, journeying through new psychedelic planes. The collection that collated his acid poetry from this period, and which concerns itself at the very core with transformation and metamorphosis, was entitled Moline. He later named it his favourite of all his works, although the critics universally panned it pretty much at the time. Moline was the mythical plant that was given to Odysseus in the Odyssey by the god Hermes, who was disguised as a young man with down just showing on his face. As an apotropaic ward to protect from the magic of the witch Circe, who had already turned his men into pigs. The title of his poem, Moline, goes thus. Nightmare of beasthood, snorting, how to wake. I wake. What beasthood skin she made me take? Leathery toad that ruts for days on end, or cringing, dribbling dog, man's servile friend, or cat that prettily pounces on its meat, tortures it hours but does not care to eat. Parrot, moth, shark, wolf, crocodile, ass, flea, what germs, what jostling mobs there were in me. These seem like bristles, and the hide, it's tough. No claw or web here, each foot ends in hoof. Into what bulk has method disappeared? Like ham streaked, I am gross, grey, gross, flap-eared. The pale lashed eyes, my only human feature. My teeth, tear, I am the snouted creature that bites through anything, root, wire, or can. If I was not afraid, I'd eat a man. Though a man's flesh is already in mine. Hand and foot poised to risk, buried in swine. I root, and you think that it is greed. It is, but I seek out a plant I need. Direct me, gods, whose changes are all holy, to where it flickers in the grass, the moline. Cool flesh of magic in each leaf or shoot, from the milky flower to the black forked root. From this fat dungeon I could rise to skin and human title, putting pig within. I push my big, grey, wet snout through the green, dreaming a flower I have never seen. Years after, when discussing his use of meter during this period, as opposed to free verse, which many of his contemporaries in America employed, Gunn said, "Later on, I realized what I was doing. I was filtering the experiences of the infinite through the grid of the finite." George Andrews, whose many psychedelic poems ramble on freely for several pages, tried to embrace the infinite in its form. Gunn, however, gave it shape, just as Andrews knew it would need to have found eventually when he said bringing transcendental purity into terrestrial form. This is, of course, what Gunn did poetically. Although it wasn't totally unique to psychedelic poetry, Gunn, later reflecting, put this down to the influence of Thomas Mann. In the English tradition, the idea of language becoming a funnel for extreme experience was also explored by Robert Graves in his poem The Cool Web. He wrote, "There's a cool web of language winds us in, retreat from too much joy and too much fear." For Graves, this was written 10 years after his horrific experiences in the Great War. Yet although the narrative voice speaks of a somber tone of children, magnifying their sense and need of innocence in those dark times, he also seems acutely aware of the powers of language to distill extreme experiences of not only fear, but also of joy, or one might say together, of the sublime. Gunn had used the power of poetry as an historically developed form to bring terrestrial reality of the psychedelic infinite to bear on his work. There is, in the poem Moline, another thread at work as well. Therein lies the critique that Andrews was developing before him. To return to the myth, Moline was apotropaic. It was a ward to protect from the nefarious magic of the witch Circe, and I would argue, in the manner in which Gunn employs the myth, through which he was funneled the infinite, that this indeed was the magic of the everyday from which one needs the occasional protection. The everyday magic, working through the social and familial charms, conjuring the webs and effects of society, goes to work on us from the moment our senses become self-perceived and constructs our egos. And the manner of our identities should be posited in the world. The effects that make us the toad that ruts for days on end, 9 till 5, or the cringing, dribbling, servile dogs at the beck and call of pre-designed laws and social norms, or the cats that tortures for pleasure and not for need. Post-Animal Farm, the pig that consumes capitalistically everything that it comes across, be it a new television, a sofa, a popular ideal, or merely the story that is fed to us from society and the hierarchy of society. Here is Circe. Here is the witch. She is playing the role of society, and she is turning his men into these various things. Moline is the great protector. I root, and you think that it is greed. It is, but I seek out a plant I need. As the consuming pigs of George Orwell and Tom Gunn might have us, we have a ravenous hunger, which we might stumble across the dream, or, in this case, the psychedelic experience. Would we be so lucky as to find the Moline? Gunn certainly did, as in San Francisco in the mid-60s, it was there to be found and plentiful. And his poem Street Song from the same collection nicely illustrates this. Notice in the opening line how the street dealer takes the form of Hermes to Odysseus, the young, near beardless man. I am too young to grow a beard. But yes, man, it was me you heard in dirty denim and dark glasses. I see through everyone who passes. So ask him clear and do not plead. Keys, lids, acid, and speed. Now my grass is not oregano. Some of it grew in Mexico. Clara green, Acapulco gold, Panama red, you name it, man, best on the street since I began. Now my methadrine, my double son, will give you 2 lives for your one. 5 days of power before you crash. At which point, use these lumps of hash. They smell so sweet, they smoke so smooth, and they make you sharper while they soothe. Now here, the best I've got to show, made by a righteous cat I know. pure acid. It will scrape your brain and turn it into something else again. Call it heaven, call it hell. Join me and see the world I sell. Join me and I will take you there, and your head will cut out from your hair into whatever self you choose. With Midday Mick, man, you can't lose. I've got everything you need. Keys, lids, acid, and speed. In one sense, Gunn has developed the critique used by the psychedelic left, although I think more largely he takes a swipe at society of both left and right, and indeed of any socio-political manipulation of identity. Join me and I will take you there. Your head will cut out from your hair into whatever self you choose. While George Andrews was very particular about his criticism of war, and the bomb in particular, Gunn takes aim at a hierarchy of social construction. The power of transformation lies not in the essential new moral hierarchy that is recognized in the throes of the psychedelic experience, but rather as a ward to the nefarious magic of the everyday world. LSD is thus a breathing space in which to transform the ways that society at large had previously inhibited. The infinite, for Gunn, is not best described as a point of a diamond. It is unformed space, freed of everyday constraints. And when the poet returns and funnels through his poetical form, he is choosing the manner of its manifestation in the everyday world. It is empowering the poet's own magical interference and the ability to charm the social in return, just as the social will continue and attempt to charm the poet. Only the social might momentarily be confounded by whatever self you choose. For Gunn, LSD had been fully launched upon the social and expanded rapidly as the 1960s wore on. And with it, the experience had its critique of the everyday developing alongside it. And it became entwined with the counterculture and morphed into what we know today as the psychedelic left. I think Alan, who's talking a bit later, will be talking about the psychedelic right. And it was able to leave the experience itself to an extent and take the body of poetical criticism. This perhaps found its fullest expression in the London Underground with the English poet Adrian Mitchell, and in particular his poem Open Day at Porton. Adrian Mitchell was a remarkable poet, playwright and journalist. He was also a prominent figure in the British left, an important figure in the underground poetry scene in London. Being perhaps the star of the famous International Poetry Incarnation event at the Royal Albert Hall in 1965, which also included Allen Ginsberg amongst its participants. In Mitchell's poem, Loose Leaf Poem, he tells the reader something of his political persuasion. He writes, "My brain is socialist, my heart anarchist, my eyes pacifist, and my blood revolutionary." Political in his outlook, Mitchell is also an important influence on other British underground poets. And although there is scant record of himself being a user of psychedelics, he will no doubt have been at the centre of a scene that employed them regularly and would have been familiar with their effects. Thus, his poetry was never outspoken about drugs generally, or psychedelics specifically. His political, pacifist persuasion meant, however, that he did touch upon the topic when it came to the employment of such substances by the Ministry of Defence. It is here that we arrive full circle in the poetic critique, from where Ginsberg first stated, "This is the end of man." Porton Down, on the Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, is a military research facility that specialises in chemical warfare, and which during the 1950s and 1960s conducted a series of experiments employing a range of psychoactive substances. Amongst the tested chemicals was D-lysergic acid dithylamide, a hallucinogen largely being investigated as a psychotomimetic and possible weapon of war, i.e. as a field incapacitant. In the summer of 1969, Porton threw open its doors and held a series of public open days, which the director of the facility, Neville Gadsby, openly discussed their LSD experiments. They even went so far as to publicly show the film made of the 1964 Operation Moneybags experiment, which I'm sure many of you have seen. A lot of like tree hugging and having fun, and it's an amazing video if you haven't seen it. The historian Andy Roberts has noted, though this was widely covered in the media, the story faded away within a week because there was no accompanying editorial outcry against testing chemicals on troops. There was, however, an underground poetic reaction to the story, which was Adrian Mitchell's open day at Porton. The poem was first read out on John Peel's Night Ride show on the 5th of March 1969, and was later published in his collection Ride the Nightmare. Here we find a scathing critique of a militarised establishment that will have seemed to Mitchell, surrounded by the colourful psychedelia of the London Underground, to have been madness personified. Goes something like this. These bottles are filled with madness, a kind of liquid madness concentrate, which can be drooled across the land, leaving behind a shuddering human highway. A welder trying to eat his own arm. Children pushing stale food into their eyes to try and stop the chemical spectaculars from pulsating inside of their hardening skulls. A health visitor throwing herself down the stairs, climbing back up again, throwing herself down again, screaming, "Take the nails out of my head." There is no damage to property. Now, we don't really like manufacturing madness, but if we didn't manufacture madness in bottles, we wouldn't know how to deal with bottled madness. Now, we don't know how to deal with bottled madness. We all really hate manufacturing madness in bottles, but if we didn't manufacture madness in bottles, we wouldn't know how to be sane. Responsible madness experts do assure us that Britain would never be the first to uncork this global brainquake. But suppose some foreign nut sprayed Kent with his insanity aerosol. Well, there is only one answer to madness. Mitchell's repeated use of madness treating madness, or madness teaching madness, of madness attempting to contextualize sanity, is cyclically maddening, and brings to mind the idea that in fact it is the blind leading the blind. The media voice, a welder trying to eat his own arm, is taken in conjunction with that of the mad director. Mitchell must have wondered as he composed the poem. Did they realise that LSD had already made the people mad? Mad at their leaders, mad at their drab insanity, and that in actuality, LSD had given those in the counterculture the ability to be protected from the mad magic of the everyday. For LSD poets, it appears that the psychedelic experience had an inherent ability to critique, which was provided by the ability to stand out from oneself under the influence, an ability for Mitchell that the officers and scientists at Porton Down had failed to recognise, but which had filtered out into popular society and had become an ironic, humorous anger in light of their bottled madness, just as Ginsberg had unwittingly done 10 years before when he had opened the bottle for the first time. If, of course, you can choose to be whatever self you deem to be, left, right, or simply high, then being able to constructively critique oneself, one's poetry, one's society, is far from madness as one might be. The trippers and the poets had learnt a lesson which they believed those in power had not, and is best summed up by Roger McGough's poem for National LSD Week, Mind How You Go. Thank you very much.